Yeah, welcome. My name is Lotte Juhl Petersen, and I work here at Wysing Art Center as the curator. And I would love to welcome you all to the final residency event entitled NEMATODE. This event is specially devised by the three residency artists, Kit Craig, Joey Holder, and Takeshi Shiomitsu. And they have devised a flexible framework for us from 2 to 6, where we would talk about different ideas, and they will also show work in progress that they have been developing during the residency, and fragments of images. And this will all take place in Wysing's gallery space and as well online on This Is Tomorrow, being broadcast today. I'm just going to go through the structure of today because alongside the three residency artists, we're also very privileged to have external contributors coming in. So we're very privileged to have artist and researcher Emily Rosamond to come in and present today. And we have also Irene Revell, who is director of Electra, to come in to do a special reading and present 3 different films during the day. And then we have Chris Fite-Wassilak to come in and do an in-conversation, especially in relation to Kit Craig's work and ideas that has developed through the residency. So after my welcome, we're very honored to have Emily Rosamond to come in and present ideas on the Umwelt and the operational image in response to Joey Holder's work in progress that you are seeing behind me. And then after this presentation and in conversation with you as the audience, Irene Revell is going to present 3 films by Sandra Lahire and read a text written with artist Kirsten Schrödinger in response to the 3 discussions that Irene actually had during her time here during the spring at Wysing with the 3 residency artists. So after her reading, the first film of Sandra Lahire will be shown, called Plutonium Blonde, which is a 15 minutes long film. Then we will have a break with refreshments out in the reception, but there's also an opportunity for you to see the work of Joey Holder here in the gallery space. Then after the break, we will go back into the gallery space, and Chris Fite-Wassilak and Kit Craig will be in conversation on Kit's work that he has been developing, and it's very much work in progress. I would like to kind of express that it's an opportunity to see work in progress. And that would be followed by another film by Sandra Lahire, Uranium Hex, which is an 11 minutes long film. We have a break after this film. And again, this is an opportunity to experience the work of Joey Holder. And then Takeshi Shiomitsu will present a work in progress which is combined with a painting, a slideshow and notes. And to end this day, Sandra Lahire will show another work of her, which is a 30-minute long film. And I very much encourage all of you then to stay on from 5:30 into the reception, and we'll have drink together. So all of these breaks throughout this afternoon is also really an opportunity, obviously, to talk to each other, but it's also an opportunity to keep some of the conversation going around the work or thoughts that you had based on the readings or presentations. And then just a quick note on the nematode, just because you might wonder why this event is called nematode. So basically, the 3 artists in residency and other members of staff and other artists from Wysing had the opportunity to go to the Sanger Institute. And to develop this event, it's very much a group effort, actually. So the title for this event came out of a group outing to the Sanger Institute, where the word nematode occurred several times throughout our day visits. And for those of you who are not so aware of what a nematode is, I printed out 12 pages from Wikipedia. Not that I'm going to perform this in any way, not that I feel privileged to have this knowledge at all, but basically it's a round worm that has successfully adapted itself to nearly every ecosystems in the world, from marine to freshwater to soils, and from polar regions to the tropics. So the reason why the artists were very much inspired by this word from their group outing was very much also to think about process and infinity, that this actually worm, it exists in every single ecosystem in the world, and also in a subtle way think about the theme that we are having here at Wysing about the multiverse, that it actually kind of, as a metaphor, kind of brings ideas around endless possibilities and endless world. And so you can maybe have that in mind, not to kind of say that the word nematode exists in the works that are work in progress that you will see today, but it's more like an inspirational metaphor to think about infinity, process, and endless possibilities and different worlds, and a kind of object or a living organism living in different worlds. So thanks a lot to the artists for actually making this effort, because it's very much an event that came out of their interest and their ideas. And thanks a lot to all of the external contributors coming in to also make this event happen. This is our final event of the Multiverse Spring Residency. And often when I say that this is the final event, I do feel it's actually more like a new beginning, because the residency artist idea will flourish beyond the residency time here. And the relationship that we do create with artists in residency is really, really important, and create ongoing relationships. So, so a huge thanks to the artists in residency here for spending time at Wysing, and a thanks to all of you for coming here today. What we also have to say, actually, by the end of this welcome, is that can you please turn off your mobile phones, because that might disturb the broadcast that we're having today. And another thing I would like to also just say is that we will, during the event here, put out some evaluation forms. So it's very much appreciated you to give us some feedback what you felt about the event, because that's always really learnable, what you felt as an audience that the event gave to you. You have also received a text that Irene is reading. So this text you can obviously look at while Irene Revell is reading after Emily's presentation, but you can also just have it as a souvenir and read it at home. So, so yeah, I will let Emily Rosamond come up here to the microphone, and then thank you for responding in this way today.
Hello. Oh, wow, this is just my height. Amazing. So first of all, I want to say thank you so much to Lotta and to Joey for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be back at Wysing. I actually did a residency here. I can't believe it's 5 years ago, but I was in residence 5 whole years ago. Yeah, where does the time go? So it's really wonderful for me to come back. And I've also been following Joey's work now for over 3 years. I've been a huge fan. I haven't actually written about Joey's work properly yet, but it's definitely in the cards. And so it's really exciting for me to have an opportunity to respond to her work as well, and to be back here in my sort of writer's shoes rather than my artist's shoes. So a little bit about me. I suppose I should introduce myself first. So I'm an artist and writer. I come from Canada, and I'm currently finishing a PhD at Goldsmiths in the art department. And what I wanted to present today is really more, it's less of a lecture and more of an opportunity for conversation, I hope. So what I'm hoping to do is generate some questions that come out of a few parallel lines of curiosity that have come out of my doctoral work, and also my thinking about Joey's work over the last 3 years. I decided to go without any images today because, well, Joey's work is so thoroughly amazing as it is. I didn't want to clutter the imagery at all. But hopefully it playing in the background will give you an opportunity to make some connections as I'm speaking with Joey's work. And I'd really invite you to respond to the work at the end of my talk. The one downside to that is that I will be mentioning the name of some theorists and thinkers and things like that. I know that's hard to catch sometimes when it's just vocally said. So if there's somebody that I mentioned that you're really interested in hearing a bit more about, please just come and grab me after the talks or ask me a question, or you can interrupt me. That's totally fine as well. So what I wanted to do is to give a few different thoughts that are sort of swimming around this idea of the multiverse. Now, I'm no expert on the concept of the multiverse as a sort of physical or philosophical concept, but one way that I wanted to open this up is to think about a multiverse as perhaps something that happens, shall we say, within one universe. So to think of the world as sort of split up by all the perceptual worlds that might make up one given milieu. And this is something that the biosemiologist Jakob von Uexküll, who was born in 1864 and died in 1944, kind of invented. He has a concept called the Umwelt, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And what he was really interested in doing is coming up with a way to think about ecology that was a little bit backwards from the way that many people might have conceived of it. So rather than seeing an ecosystem as made up of this mammal, that worm, this nematode, etc., he was more interested in seeing it instead as made up from multiple universes, right? So each animal, each plant, each worm, each insect has its own set of perceptual capacities and propensities, right? Its own set of affects. And as such, it lives in its own world. And the way that those worlds fit together is what an ecosystem actually is for von Uexküll. And so I'm really interested in this idea and some of the ways in which I think it might be becoming newly significant and differently significant at the moment. So this comes out of kind of a hunch that I have about Joey's work. And of course, you're very welcome to disagree with my theory of Joey's work. But something I've been thinking about it for a long time. And I tend to think about Joey's work as being a proposition for accelerating the relationship between biological and digital perception, if you will, to sort of go past the distinction between how a camera sees and how, I don't know, a jellyfish or some kind of out there sea creature sees, right? To imagine that they're all subject to the same form of eroticism, perhaps, and that there's something analogous about digital reproduction and biological reproduction that happens through this like complex interchange that happens with images, right, and bodies. And on the other side, what I'm talking about comes out of a hunch that I've been developing in my doctoral work. And that's around this hunch that I'm sort of developing, and I think it might end up in a book rather than in my PhD, is something like the idea of an embedded first-person perspective on the world, right? A very subjective perspective is becoming newly politicized at the moment, right? And to give you an example of why I think that might be the case, I don't know if some of you might be able to share in this sentiment, but yesterday morning I had quite a strong experience of it. So waking up and checking my Facebook feed and the news and being like, wait, what? Conservative win? What? Wait, majority win? What, right? And then thinking, okay, so why am I so surprised by that, right? Now, as we know, the polls were wrong. They were very wrong. But I know that polls are wrong. So why was I so completely shocked, right? Why did this so totally not fit my worldview? And then I thought, oh yeah, Facebook. right? Like many people, I end up getting a lot of my news through my Facebook feed. But of course, my friends, many of them, if not all, tend to share my political views. And furthermore, Facebook has its own algorithms, which will filter what I see in my news feed. So things that I've clicked on previously, it will suggest things that might be similar to that, right? And this is something that Eli Pariser, in a book that he published in 2012, calls a filter bubble. And alternatively, he calls it a U-loop, right? So this is a tendency in filtered online experience to, ever since it started to be algorithmically filtered when Google in 2009 started filtering search results, this tendency for online space to sort of affirm what we already think we might know, or what we already might be interested in, or what we already might like, right? So that it's actually quite possible to live in this like sort of progressive political bubble online and then wake up to a very different reality when some election results come in, for example. So this is going to have, I think, very profound effects on what political agency might look like in the future, right? And what it means to construct a social space in the future. And it all comes down to this idea of a self-centered world, of sort of parsing out one shared world, country, universe, whatever it is, platform online, into multiple perspectives that are kind of shared out amongst smaller subgroups. So what I really want to leave you with is a question, right? And this is a question around what, as artists, as art writers, as cultural practitioners in any way, we might be able to do with this new politicization of a first-person embedded perspective, right? What are the roles of artworks, artists, aesthetic practices more broadly, in questioning the lines between a first-person perspective and something like an objective perspective, whatever we might mean by that. And that's also a very complex question, of course. And what might the roles of artists be in activating a relationship or redistributing, reevaluating the relationships between computation and perception? And this is something that I think that Joey's work speaks to very directly. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the Umwelt and Jakob von Uexküll. So von Uexküll died in 1944, as I mentioned, and he's a Baltic German biologist and biosemioticist, and he worked in a lot of different areas, including animal behavior studies, muscular physiology, and the cybernetics of life. But definitely his most important contribution is seen to be this concept of the Umwelt, or the self-centered world. And he was particularly interested in imagining the perceptual universes of creatures that might see the world in extremely different ways than you or I would see them. So he's really interested in things like ticks, sea urchins, amoebae, jellyfish, and sea worms. And incidentally, these are often some of the main characters in many of Joey's works and Tumblr pages and all kinds of things. And so von Uexküll was highly influential for a lot of thinkers. So Agamben writes about him, Deleuze and Guattari write about him, Heidegger was influenced by him. But for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to mostly focus on Elizabeth Grosz, who writes about him in her work from 2008, which is called Chaos, Territory, Art, Deleuze and the Framing of the Earth. And so Elizabeth Grosz is quite a wonderful Deleuzian feminist. And in this book that she published in 2008, she's positing an aesthetic theory that is really based on an idea that art is an animal phenomenon. It's not particularly about humans cultivating taste and rationality, et cetera, right? It's an animal phenomenon that comes from this sort of absolute diversity of sexual selection in the natural world, right? And so she argues in this book that, this is kind of amazing, that Darwin, unlike a vast majority of his followers, was a feminist, because he didn't actually reduce everything to natural selection, right? Coming up with finding a mate, finding X, Y, and Z characteristics attractive and not anything else. He also had another principle, which was completely separate from that and irreducible to that, and that's a principle of sexual selection. And for Elizabeth Grosz, the only rule about that is absolute difference, absolute proliferation, right? Trying things, attracting, relating in absolutely any possible way, right? Using all of the possibilities. And so for Elizabeth Grosz, von Uexküll's idea of the Umwelt is very, very important, right? As a sort of basis, as one of the main bases for her theory, her aesthetic theory, her theory of art, right? So to think about how creatures sort of form counterpoints, she uses, as von Uexküll does, ideas of music and musicality to think about the relationship between an organism and its Umwelt, right? So some of the ideas that are incredibly important that she picks up from von Uexküll have to do with the idea of, first of all, subtraction. So the idea that the universe, whatever that might be, the objective world, if indeed we can talk about that, is vastly broader and larger than any one organism can take in or understand. So every organism has some kind of a subtractive relationship to that, right? And every organism's Umwelt would be exactly as complex as their sense organs, right? Their perceptual capacities, and also this idea of musicality, right? So she thinks about the world as forming a sort of counterpoint, which any organism has to play. And one of the animals that von Uexküll writes about, and it's quoted quite a lot and written about quite a lot by Agamben and by Deleuze, he talks about the tick. And so Elizabeth Grosz talks about this as well, right? And so she says, the tick is a creature that is blind, deaf, and mute. And its world really consists of a very, very limited number of affects, right, or perceptual capacities. It's sensitive to heat, it's sensitive to the smell of mammals' sweat, and it's sensitive to the taste of blood. And those are kind of the main affects, right? So its whole life, right, consists in sleeping, waiting, lying in wait, right? Once it has mated, in climbing a branch or a tree or something like that, guided by nothing but the light relating to its photosensitive skin and the heat that the light implies. When a mammal comes along underneath said twig or branch, the tick will smell the butyric acid that's in the sweat and drop onto the skin. And if it's lucky enough to actually land properly, it will burrow its way toward an area with as little hair as possible. And then it will start gorging itself on blood. As soon as it's full, it will drop off, lay its eggs, and the cycle begins again, right? Now, for Elizabeth Grosz, what's so important about von Uexküll is that many biologists would think about the tick's behavior in terms of concepts like reflexes, right? Or, saying, well, there's just these stimuli in the environment, and then the tick responds to those stimuli in a very instinctive way. But Grosz said, well, it's so much more rich, it's so much more interesting, and it's so much more, it places so much more importance on aesthetic questions, let's say, to think about it in quite the opposite way, to say the tick's Umwelt is calling to it to play, right? To play like an instrument in its world in a very particular way, right? The Umwelt, the sensory capacities call to the creature to act and to behave, right? Now, I'm going to skip down a bit, and so this is just a little quote. Grosch writes, "The tick and the mammal create a kind of provisional totality, a bubble world. The mammal is the tune whose melody the tick has to play. It cannot discern the qualities of the mammal it falls on. It cannot perceive the vast bulk of information that even the branch it alights on could provide some differently structured organism. The tick lives in a simplified world, a harmonic world of its own rhythms and melody, a melody composed by its Umwelt, the conjunction mammal-twig-sun, in which it is a connective, an instrument." Now, obviously, as with any theory, von Uexküll is not simply agreed with across the board, and some people have contested whether or not human perception should fit into the Umwelt. So some people say, well, humans are complex, and therefore, we don't live in Umwelts. Only animals who have very restricted perception, like ticks, do. But I think that from a Deleuzian perspective, or from Elizabeth Grosch's perspective, we all subtract, right? All perception, all acts of perception are subtractions from a larger web of possibilities. But Elizabeth Grosch, in the passage I just quoted from, uses the term bubble world. And there's a big resonance here between bubble world and Eli Pariser's concept of the filter bubble. So now I'm going to try to make this leap from biosemiotics to the politics of online spaces, right? And I know it's a bit of a large leap, but I'm hoping to do so to suggest that maybe some of these biological ideas, biosemiotic ideas, could throw a bit of a fresh perspective on what's happening to people online and people's perceptions online. So what happens when the bubble world is a melody created by the interaction of human organisms and algorithms? Pariser, in his book, The Filter Bubble, How the Personalized Web is Changing What We Read and How We Think, right, refers to the filtering of online search results, which happened in 2009 as an invisible revolution in how we consume information, one that will shape how we learn, what we know, and even how our democracy works. And I don't know about you guys, but I was certainly feeling that way yesterday myself. And so there's this idea that a lot of people, not only Pariser, are talking about when they talk about things like algorithmic governmentality online, that the internet has been designed to promote a sort of free flow of information, right? This is something that Jaron Lanier, who's quite an interesting thinker, I'd be happy to share YouTube lecture links with him if anyone's interested. He talks about this a lot. He says, my friends and I were the ones who came up with the idea that things should be shareable for free online. Information should circulate for free online. Interestingly, what he's saying now is we were mistaken on one front. We failed to take into account the fact that if information circulates freely, it will give rise to a situation where those who have the largest computational capacities, those who run the big servers in the background, can accumulate vast concentrations of power, completely unprecedented. And this is happening. How it comes into our perception, ironically, is very difficult to see because it has to do with what we don't see, right? What is filtered out of, like my Facebook feed, for example, right? When I thought the whole world was this happy little labor and green vote swap land until yesterday morning. So there's a lot that's happening about filtration, right? And the significance that has for concepts of aesthetic and perception in politics, right? So Pariser, He writes that there's sort of a performative problem with this logic, and I'll just read a brief quote from his book. He says, "Most personalized filters are based on a three-step model. First, you figure out who people are and what they like, right? And just as an aside, there's quite a lot of companies that specialize in online identification of users, right? So they'll do analyses of IP address activity and then try to figure out something about who you are, right? Who you like, are you male or female, right? These kinds of questions are being answered invisibly by all kinds of companies and corporations without their subjects, right, us, ever actually knowing that it's going on, right? But I return to my quote. So first you figure out who people are and what they like. Then you provide them with content and services that best fit them. Finally, you tune to get the fit just right. Your identity shapes your media. There's just one flaw in this logic. Media also shape identity. And as a result, these services may end up creating a good fit between you and your media by changing you. If a self-fulfilling prophecy is a false definition of the world that through one's actions becomes true, we're now on the verge of self-fulfilling identities in which the internet's distorted picture of us becomes who we really are. So there's this idea that within online experience, there's kind of a feedback loop coming up, right? So if somebody is clicking on a certain type of thing, a host of different algorithmic identification practices that are burbling away in the background will start to feed those characteristics back, right? And magnify them. What does that do to a social body? What does that do politically when you end up kind of pushing people into divided factions of perspectives on the world, right? And so Pariser is one of the theorists who is trying to articulate online spaces in terms of politics, right? He's certainly not the only one to do so. Another is Tarleton Gillespie, who's an American writer, who in 2012 was talking about, for instance, trying to define the politics of, say, Twitter algorithms, Twitter trending algorithms. So he's saying, for example, that you can't know what these algorithms are exactly because those are Twitter's secret sauce and they would not like you to know. However, you can kind of get a general sense of more or less what their properties and propensities might be. So, for example, Twitter has trending algorithms that will pick up things that are sort of might be mildly interesting to a vast swath of different networks and different groups of people who use Twitter, right? And Tarleton Gillespie says, well, that kind of leads to a Habermasian sense of social space, by which he means one that's based on the idea of a shared conversation and the idea that people can communicate and talk to one another and find some common ground, right? It's a kind of algorithm that finds some common ground. But on the other hand, he says it's very possible to imagine another kind of trending algorithm, right? One that would be sort of predisposed to find things that really, really impassioned and inflamed very small networks or groups of people who use Twitter, right? And it would pick up those. And then he says, well, this would be a more sort of Mooffian idea of social space that such an algorithm would provide us with, right? One that's based on the idea that antagonism, right, conflict is absolutely profoundly fundamental to any kind of shared space, any kind of political space, and that the act of negotiating and navigating those differences is really fundamental to how we must negotiate being with others, right? But for people like Pariser and Gillespie, they're still sort of preserving a kind of a political analysis model of algorithms, right? They're very much focused, I would argue, on human subjects and how algorithms are filtering what humans perceive and what humans can become, right? What kind of subject positions become possible for us because of what they are allowing us to see. But I think it's possible to go even further, right? To step a little bit outside of the human subject position computation when thinking about the importance, the significance of the relationships between perception and computation that are at stake today, I would argue. And so some people who do that are Haroon Farokhi and more recently Trevor Paglen. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about his essay that was published in November 2014 as part of the eFlux commemorative issue on Haroon Farokhi's work. So Trevor Paglen poses a very simple question at the beginning of this essay, and he says, what happens when machines start to see for themselves? And he says, Haroon Farokhi was one of the people who first thought of this question, right? Who first thought to pose this question. So, for instance, his film I, Machine 3, which is from 2003, he is really trying, Paglen argues, to see how a machine might see. And so he comes up with this theory of the operational image, and he says images aren't just about sort of reflecting and like ideologically, like, you know, what we think about or something. They're not just about representing a politics. They're actually acting on the world, quite literally, right? So one of the examples that Haroon Farokhi was quite interested in is that in the early 80s, missiles started to store images, right? And then take images in flight and be actively comparing between one image and the other, right? And so Farokhi has these images where there's like dotted lines that show the computer's act of comparing the two images to make sure that the missile's on target, right? And Trevor Paglen is trying to engage with these things. He says, well, 2003, I mean, that's ages ago in terms of on the scale of increased computational abilities. A lot has happened since then. So how can we think about operational images in the present? And after, he said after, months and months of research and talking to a lot of people who are allowing images to quite directly operate, right, from, technologies like, for example, automated license plate readers is just one instance. And he says, ironically, operational images are invisible. They don't actually exist. What he calls meat-eye perception, right, is just not relevant to how computers understand the world and how they see. So we have this bizarre situation in which the operational images, right, the images that have some kind of direct agency, that have some kind of direct ability to act on the world, increasingly aren't even images in a sense that we would understand an image, right? And they're becoming quite invisible, although they control and influence a lot of what is happening in our lives, right, all the time. So this is one of the sort of ironies of computation, right, the relationships between computation and perception. So I don't know of anyone else who has used the von Uexküll's concept of the umlaut to talk about questions about algorithmic governmentality and filter bubbles, although there might well be. Maybe some of you know someone, you can tell me. It's a little bit of an odd fit, but I felt like it's very fitting for Joey's work and very fitting for the way that Joey's work conceptualizes mechanical and computational sort of acts of quote-unquote perception with biological questions about perception, right? And so for me, Joey's images, when she shows weird sea creatures or something like that, the question isn't necessarily like what do these things look like, but it's also how do they look, how do they see, right? How can the digital image sort of get us to transport ourselves inside of the creatures, the organisms' perceptual possibilities? And so I will leave you with that and with the question, right, of what are the stakes of the relationship between computation and perception today? And if anyone has any questions or comments or even just reflections on Joey's work, be great to open a little bit up about that right now. So thank you very much. I know it's a lot to take in, I would imagine. And I wasn't sure if it would be best to sort of discuss some of these things now, or if it would be better to kind of just keep the conversation going over breaks. But yeah.
I saw a movie last night. It was Her. Which sounded quite similar to what you're talking about, because it was a relationship between a man and his operating system, and they fall in love, and as spoiler well, the operating system itself starts seeing in this way that you were talking about, and can really see so much. And eventually, the operating system, a woman, describes her relationship with this human man that it's like reading a book that she knows and loves, but it's like the words, and she's so familiar with the words, but the spaces of the word, it's like it slows down, and the spaces between the words, she finds herself residing in more and more. There's so much more there that he can't interact with, and she herself as an operating system didn't see in the same way, but her perception was very, she would read books and instants and connect with other, just assimilate so much more information. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I haven't seen this film myself, actually, so maybe you can tell me more about it in the break. But it's really interesting. It seems like, there are a lot of narratives around that are about staging this kind of question, right? Like how do machines see us? How are human perceptions sort of influenced by the mechanical propensities with which we surround ourselves every day, right? And what does it mean to, let's say, practice some kind of I want to say like an ethics of digital empathy almost, right? Like what is it to ask questions like, as Peglin points out, Furoki was asking, right? How can I see like a machine, right? Given how much agency these images have, right? How can I try to understand the world like that world, right? Like that world of machines. There's a lot of really interesting questions there. And difficult ones too. I think that, for instance, I think it's I was a bit skeptical in a way, and I'm still not totally sure if I'm completely on board with Trevor Peglin when he says, well, machines see for themselves, right? I would rather see that as there's a big question mark around that sentence, right? I think in a Deleuzian sense, right, Deleuze argues, and following from von Uexküll, he argues that it's really important to think about, for instance, cells as having perception, right? And this is something that the semiotician Charles Sanders Peirce would have said as well. This is sort of a branch of biosemiotics that's come out of von Uexküll's work. And so in that sense, I think it makes absolute sense to say that machines can see for themselves. But on the other hand, I also think that there's a bit of a tendency for theorists, and I've certainly done this myself, guilty as charged, to exaggerate a little bit, right? So for instance, I was writing in the fall a lot about the abilities of algorithms. Like for instance, there are ethical algorithms being studied right now at Brown and Tufts University, right? So that autonomous nursing robots can make ethical decisions, on the spot by themselves in a battlefield situation, let's say, right? But I think there's, so a lot of this has to do with calculating the future, right? And so I was writing about that and saying, well, it's kind of, it's crazy how much computation can actually tell about the future, right? But then I listened to people like Jaron Lanier who say, actually, not really. There's a bit of a tendency to exaggerate among theorists, right? But he says, well, computers are calculating based on statistical aggregations of information, right? And statistics can only tell so far, right? It can tell about tendency, but not necessarily structure, right? So if I move my hand like this, it might, sort of compute that it would continue, but it wouldn't necessarily be able to say much about the fact that I might hit the microphone stand, right? That was a long answer.
Question, but I'm sure these questions can also consider in the break.
Yeah, absolutely.
Be approached by anyone.
Yes, very much so, and it might be actually easier to sort of to let them the ideas sit a bit. But I mean, I'd be really curious to see if anyone wants to sort of jump in and respond to Joey's work in light of anything that I've said, or even just not just some impressions about the video.
So it's been a selfish question with the project.
Oh,
I was really struck by, I had for a student with Roche before, and this idea of musicality.
yes.
It relates, or we're going to talk about now, to what we were thinking about for our upcoming residency here in relation to Multiverse, which is around performance scores, which have this sort of potentially infinite number of repetitions. And I wonder if you could say a bit more about her idea.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a really good question, and I can't claim to be an expert on it, but it's definitely very, very interesting. As an artist, I've been working with music a little bit lately, so suddenly I'm kind of extremely interested in this as well. But I think that the idea of musicality, right, is, well, first of all, music involves rhythm, right? So the way and Grosch is definitely a Deleuzian thinker, right? So she will be very influenced by their concept of the refrain and 1,000 plateaus, right? Yeah, so let's see, what can I say about that? But I think that there's the idea that, like, for instance, musicality might be a good way to think about co-evolution, right? So that's something that, if you think about, like, somebody throws out a tune and another person harmonizes to it, or another person drums along, or whatever it is, right? The idea that, that one sort of gesture will fall into step with another, right? Will sort of harmonize or counterpoint or counterbalance another seems very, very intuitive in music. But in Elizabeth Grosch's work, she's very, very adamant that her use of music as a trope, it's not metaphorical. She means it absolutely literally. She says that music describes, she calls it counterpoint within von Uxküll. So she says that the Umwelt of the organism is in counterpoint with the organism, right? And that it calls the organism to act in certain ways. And she says it's very good for describing the co-evolution between species. So, famously, Deleuze and Guattari talk about the example of the wasp and the orchid, that, it's not possible to simply describe the evolution of an orchid, right, without also describing how it relates and syncs up with the wasp's activities in relation to it. So I think it's quite interesting. But I also really wonder where that metaphor can go, right, and what might its limitations be when it comes into, let's say, a corporate setting, right? So, for instance, I mean, in a way, like something like a Facebook feed is quite a conciliatory space, right? It's about giving you the views that you already have and reflecting them back to you, right? So what's a form of musicality, and then I wonder, how does something like Chantal Mouffe's antagonistic theory of social space fall into that, right? What is it like to have a conception of musicality in the way that Grosch suggests, but also account for the possibility of antagonism, right? Which, if we don't have it in our online experiences, it can, wake up and bite us the next morning, right? So, yeah. So these are very much questions that I have, but Grosch means them quite literally. Yes, following Deleuze and Guattari. Again, another very long answer. But yeah, very happy to discuss further. And thank you again very much.
So my name's Irene Revell, and I'm the director of Electra, which is an independent curatorial agency based in London, which focuses on intermediate traditions of sound, performance, and moving image, with a particular engagement with social and political concerns. And we have the great privilege of Wysing having invited us to be organisation in residence this summer in July and August, as part of this year here exploring the multiverse. So, in particular, for something of a theoretical framework for our time here, we've decided that we're going to focus on the work of the philosopher Karen Barad. And Barad is a theoretical particle physicist and also a queer feminist philosopher whose work draws initially on the philosophies of the 20th century physicist Niels Bohr, to go on to explore ideas of agency, performativity, and so on. So in March, my colleague Ash Reed and I came to visit Wysing and the current artists in residence, Kit, Taki, and Joey. And as part of an utterly inspiring day of discussions, mostly around the work they've been making here, we also proposed a joint reading of Karen Barad's essay, Posthumanist Performativity, towards an understanding of how matter comes to matter, originally published in Science Journal in 2003. And that text introduces her notions of interactivity and leads on to her notion of agency, which she constitutes as always relational, never singular. We read the whole text aloud, a paragraph each in turn, in the farmhouse, and it was intense but felt highly rewarding, and certainly for me seemed to seep back into the moments we'd shared earlier in the studios. And in parallel, during the same weeks, my friend Kirsten Schrödinger and I were writing a text for the journal Camera Austria. And this was a text in response to a themed issue, Disputed Landscapes. And together we turned instinctively to a trilogy of films made by the British artist Sandra Lahire, which were made in the second half of the 1980s. Plutonium Blonde, Uranium Hex, and Serpent River. And these films were made in response to the threatened deployment of cruise missiles at Greenham Common, I guess guided missiles as well. The Chernobyl disaster and the ongoing fear of a nuclear dystopia, which today of all days somehow seems equally upon us, I think. Writing this text, we inserted Karen Barad's call for a politics of diffraction rather than reflection, and I began to see echoes between Lahire's films and the day spent here at Wysing, and thought there would be a value in representing these films today, which have been very much with me in these past months. So the text that you should have is a shorter edited version of the journal text, which focuses specifically on the three films. But in the longer text, we're talking about other films from the Cininova collection, which is a collection of films that we're both involved with. So I'm going to read the text aloud now before we watch the first film, Plutonium Blonde. And then I won't say anything before the other two. Actually, could I have some water? Sorry. Diffracted Landscapes, Sandra Lahire's Nuclear Trilogy, 1987 to 1989. Lahire's trilogy, Plutonium Blondes, 1987, Uranium Hex, 1987, and Serpent River, 1989, created a dystopian outlook into a radioactive future made in the aftermath of Chernobyl and the proclaimed end of history. at the historical moment when the Cold War, with its promises of an endless source of nuclear energy, was falling apart. These three films have a very particular relationship to landscape, totalizing through their pulling in of collage references and multi-layering, yet not panoptic. As much as Lahire creates this heterogeneous coherence, it remains always partial and fleeting. There's no anchor, no vantage point, no origin. Each repeated viewing feels equally cast away. What role does radioactivity play in the image politics of depicting bodies and spaces and gaze relations? The landscapes, bodies, spaces we look at are not to be explored and occupied, but how does our gaze escape these tendencies? Teresa de Lauretis speaks about mechanisms of coherence. She espouses a fundamental suspicion towards narrativity, and yet simultaneously argues for its rearticulation, in reference to the narrative strategies in Yvonne Rainer's films. She says, feminist work in film should be not anti-narrative, not anti-Oedipal, but working, as it were, with and against narrative in order to represent not just a female desire, but the duplicity of the Oedipal scenario itself and the specific contradiction of the female subject in it. This duplicity is to be specific in regard to the history of cultural forms, as well as the context of reception. In analogy, we assume a suspicion towards a 360-degree pan, a full panoramic picture, a panoptic control scan, amidst other mechanisms of visual coherence. Returning again to de Lauretis, she cautions that it is important to consider narrativity strategically and tactically in the effort to construct other forms of coherence, to shift the terms of representation, to produce the conditions of representability of another engendered social subject. In Plutonium Blonde, narrative coherence enters in the very first images. A figure, perhaps the eponymous blonde, deliriously switching, engineers operating what we assume to be a nuclear power plant. White boiler suits dropping control rods into cuboid voids with playground song. Crocodile, wait a while, sunning yourself on the bench. None of your victims stand much of a chance of freeing themselves from your terrible jaws. The color set conducts nauseating swerves as if it were induced by a giant electromagnet, bleached out, indigo-toned. As toxic as the colors are, they still hold an allure. Color is an actor, an active participant within the other components of the images. And color signifies an invisible atomic danger. Through colorization, naturalness and reality gain ambiguity. Lahire combines the labor force of the nuclear plant with the labored production of femininity, both as nuclear processes, reactions. The colorization, dying of the film, as a transmitter between the two. As Marina Grishnik contends in writing about Plutonium Blonde, there is no difference between the politics of the medium and the politics of the topic. Both are reunited in a clash of layers within deadly light. Radioactivity is deployed as a radioactivity of the film image itself. Even the drinking water, you can't drink it to save your life. Uranium hexafluoride is a highly poisonous, colorless, crystalline radioactive matter, which is used in the uranium enrichment process that produces fuel for nuclear reactors and nuclear weapons. Uranium hex progresses these similar sound, color, visual collages with an immediate shift to Canadian accent and song, and the very specificity of indigenous cultures. Here, Lahire herself notes, reservations mutating the only gene pool. These are the conditions underlying our electricity from nuclear reactors. In Serpent River, the images seep into one another. Blue-tinted floods of water, X-rays, positive, negative, skeletons dance, description of physical labor, ice, crystal ice, blue ice, blasted rock, kids, radiated pink, day for night, skating on ice, reflections of water, reflections of the sun, flames, burning images. These are all overlaid and simultaneously shifting from one to the next. The montage is not made with sharp cuts, but the sequences seem to rather taint each other in their superimposition. Color contrasts hurt the eyes. Radiant flashes burn into the retina. The soundtrack remains autonomous, aggressive sounds of cutting through ice. Narrative bits juxtaposed with sci-fi sounds, uranium capital, nursery school, uranium in the drinking water. It was a clean town. They were generous with the hospital. Sulfur circle, Trans-Canada Highway, drilling, the sound of drilling. The film material simulates X-ray plates or is treated physically, contaminated, raw images exposed over and over again or brought into bright sub-zero winter. Serpent River may be the final film of the trilogy, but it's not come to a conclusion. Just as the nuclear activity will stay, there is no end to it. Matters of practices, doings, actions. In these three films that built the nuclear trilogy, this narrative coherency materializes in a diffracted way. Lahire shows layers of bright colors, both radiating from and X-raying into the depths of the images. We borrow the term diffraction from Karen Barad, who writes that the problem of representation should be placed in questions of diffraction rather than reflection. She cautions how each interaction, or striving for coherence, if we may put it that way, always makes a mark. As soon as one attempt at clarity is made, another is occluded. We might say that this understanding of agency complements Dolores' notion of narrative coherence, whilst also offering a possible account for simultaneous suspicion. While Barad draws from Niels Bohr's development of nuclear physics, Lahire uses radioactivity as a formal figure that escapes the patriarchal gaze. Decomposition takes place not just in the film frames, but in the context of production, in the aspects of perception. Feminism, and this is Dolores, feminism understands the female subject as one that is at once inside and outside the ideology of gender. The female subject is in both places at once. That is the contradiction. A feminist gaze towards landscape can thus be one that doesn't aim to represent what we see nor reflects on the film image what is to be seen, but rather enables a vision that is diffracted in more ways than one, with all that material can offer at stake.
Thank you to Emily and Rosamond and Joey Holder and Irene Revell for this first part. We're going to do it right now. We're running a bit behind time, but nevertheless, I think we all deserve 20 minutes break. So we come back here in 20 minutes to the gallery space. Outside in the reception, there are different refreshments for you available, and maybe also to just have like a bit of sun. So thanks a lot for this first part here. And thank for you, Irene. And we'll put down now on Joey's work. Okay, yeah, we are back in here to the gallery space. After this break, we have a very special session with Kit Craig and Chris Fite-Wassilak in conversation. But before we start this in conversation, Kit Craig has been very, very generous to show a work in progress. It's approximately 20 minutes that will be played off this monitor. So do enjoy it. Thank you.
So, where shall we start? Well, okay. It all starts with this ball. Everything is condensed into this golf ball-sized ball. It is perfectly round and has one side. It is an ideal, almost symbolic object. One-sided. A circle. Well, let me explain. Imagine this apple as a sphere. A sphere that is trying to explain itself to a circle. Trying to explain its three-dimensional form to a two-dimensional form. You get the idea. Not a circle. Not a whole sphere. A hole. A hole in a sphere. Ah, a hole. An object with a hole in it. So, that reminds me. Have you heard the one about the mathematician's coffee cup and donut? Topologically speaking, he can't tell them apart. Okay. Look, I think you're just looking at this all wrong. A donut is not the same as a sphere. It may still be one-sided, but it has a hole in it. It is a real-world approximation. An approximation of what is technically known as a torus, a pure mathematical shape that is a kind of higher-order analogue of the cylindrical ring. What, like the handle of this coffee cup? Two one-sided objects. A two-sided object. Now I understand the apple. Well, yes, that side of the apple is two-sided. But this part of the apple is different. See, it's three-sided. 1, 2, 3. A three-sided object. Oh, are we talking about donuts again? Because that's what I was thinking about. Their form. A thought about their form. A thought? I try not to have anything to do with that. Well, okay then. Not a thought. Not a form. An outline? A line? So, it's not a form. It's a line that becomes a form. But the more you say it's not something, the more it becomes that very thing. A thought thing. A made thing. And a real thing. Really? Okay. Wait a minute. I need a break. Okay, so what were we talking about? Let's take this square. Don't you mean triangle? We use this shape as the face for a three-dimensional object. It becomes a tetrahedron. A regular polygon with 4 sides made of equilateral triangles. It is an ideal, almost symbolic object. I see what's happening. So I guess 4 sides? A square? Ah. I mean, am I really supposed to be following this? I'm not sure if this is the limit of my understanding or the peak of your idiocy. We're back at the indeterminable form. Back at the golf ball. A model. A thing about something else. Um, uh, yes. Something else. Somewhere else. Now, to a certain extent, I don't really understand this next bit. In fact, I don't really understand how we got to this point, or where these forms come from. But nevertheless, here we are, and I suppose it does seem to be a useful way to describe an interaction. An interaction described by two forms moving together and then apart. So, what goes on in between? Well, that's represented by this wiggly line. Oh, a wiggly line. So, that reminds me. The other day I was looking round an old antique shop and I came across this strange object on a table at the back of the shop. The dealer noticed my interest and proceeded to tell me this far-fetched story about its provenance. Apparently it had once belonged to Charles Darwin, and he had used it as a pointer during his lectures. Well, although I really wanted to, I didn't believe him for a second. I still often think about that pointer. What's the point of such narrative interjections? I'm afraid it still doesn't help me understand how we got to this point. I suppose it has 5 points. So you're telling me you're trying to explain something, trying to teach me something you don't understand yourself? Yeah, of course. Well, you have to have a point, an argument. If you're incapable of holding that in your head, you're incapable of learning. You're acting like a complete dunce. Ah, yes, that's a good point. The word dunce originates from a metaphysical philosopher and theologian from the Middle Ages known as John Duns Scotus. His nuanced and complex dialectical approach to thorny theological questions gained him many followers known as dunsmen or dunces. John Duns Scotus and his followers were advocates of the conical hat, the point symbolizing knowledge, and the funnel shape driving this knowledge down into the head. His teachings were held in high regard and had considerable influence on both Catholic and secular thought until the rise of humanist thought in the 16th century. His dense, detailed, indirect reasoning was derided as sophistry and his followers hopelessly behind the times, incapable of understanding the new learning of Renaissance humanism. The dunces, already saddled with a reputation for pedantic argument, now became synonymous with an unrelenting, unteachable idiocy. I've got to admit, I'm not really following you. In fact, I'm not sure you're following you. Well, I don't know. Look, it's about pointing out a possible position. And the second position. There must be a position between the two. So, isn't it about time that you clarified your own position? Well, I think I just need to concentrate on what's in front of me. But what's your position? At the present moment? Roughly on the other side of the table to you. Anyway, I thought I was still on my break. Yes, the break. That's a key point. No, not the break. My break. If the link is broken, they become free. They become separate positions again. No, look, you're not listening. I need a break. To think about it differently. some real distance. That's better. So, where were we? I'm not sure how to proceed. I mean, you kept talking about a break. But, to be honest, I'm not sure if this is some sort of breakthrough, or whether it's all just utter nonsense. You mean, like, how can a thing be in two places at once? Sort of, but I'm not so worried about what that thing is. It's more about its position. I thought we were talking about its position, the place where the thing is placed. Not the thing, the place for the thing. Well, don't worry, I know my place. I mean, the place for the thing. A sculpture. A sculpture that isn't there. A sculpture that isn't there. Like a bronze statue stolen for its scrap value. There. Not there. 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 Yeah. Not the form, the place of the form. A form that isn't there. Formless. A formless position. Two forms. Two formless positions. So it's not just a wiggly line. You've been making it out to be some sort of formless form with nothing on its mind. But it's not. It's a form. It's a stone. If we look closely, we can see a hard sedimentary nodule primarily composed of colloidal silica, cryptocrystalline silica, and various other impurities. If we look even closer, we see all these components themselves are made up of further components with a certain atomic structure. Conversely, if we look outwards, we see this stone was part of a landscape, a block of matter, formed, shaped, and eroded by its surroundings. But in front of us now is just a thing, a form, a naturally occurring stone to be studied and appreciated. There are four important qualities of these scholar stones. They are shu, thinness, tu, openness, lu, perforations, and zu, wrinkling. Another prized quality of these stones is their representation or resemblance of a landscape or a figure. But surely it's not a thing. It's either made up of an aggregate of smaller things, or on the other hand, it's a bit of a larger thing. Maybe they're a model, a found model, or a made model. Enlarged, a small maquette accurately measured with calipers and scaled up into a large polystyrene form. Ah. Oh. The problem is, these precise intentions of yours always end up getting lost in the process. You've got to admit, none of this is very clear. It's all knotted up, nothing to do with those careful initial measurements. It's another typically overcomplicated, incomprehensible, and tiresome monologue. Ah, so that reminds me. A while back I was reading this book about the legend of the Gordian knot. It was an extremely complicated knot tied by Gordius, the king of Phrygia, in the city of Gordian. This knot was supposedly impossible to unravel, and an oracle came to predict that whoever untied it would become the ruler of the whole of Asia. Many individuals came to Gordian to try and undo the knot. They all failed. Then, according to his biographers, Alexander the Great visited the city in 333 BC. After unsuccessfully trying to find the ends of the knot, Alexander became impatient, took out his sword, and sliced through the knot. Alexander went on to conquer Asia, thus fulfilling the oracle's prophecy. No doubt the tale is an allegorical account of Alexander's forthright approach to problem solving, and has led to the saying cutting the Gordian knot, which means solving a complicated problem through a bold action. A bold action. So, here we are. Where are we again? Well, weren't we talking about a wiggly line? A complicated wiggly line. A wiggly line represented by this wiggly line. I thought we were trying to get away from that. I mean, I really struggle with these wiggles of yours. I guess the problem is, if you have no idea how it's going to turn out, how do you expect me to? It's just so undisciplined, unkempt, and unaccountable. Insignificant, indeterminate, and inadvertent. Ah. There. 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 There's got to be a way through. Yeah. Right. Okay. Oh yeah. So, dotted throughout the landscape of Cyprus are concentrations of perforated monoliths. These large standing stones are made of limestone and range from 2 to 3 metres in height. Uniquely, all of them have a large symmetrical hole that's been carved right through their middle or upper parts. Legends revolving around these monoliths have developed over the centuries and become part of Cypriot folklore. These tales usually involved climbing through the hole of the monolith and were believed to have therapeutic, healing, and fertility powers. The theory that these monoliths marked the location of hidden treasures became particularly popular in the 19th century. This led Luigi Palma di Cesnola, the renowned archaeologist, whose hoard of Cypriot antiquities became one of the founding collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, to excavate numerous sites surrounding these monoliths. Cesnola found no evidence of treasure and concluded that these monoliths were related to the worship of Aphrodite. But recent archaeological research suggests these mysterious monoliths are in fact part of an ancient machinery used in the extraction of olive oil and abandoned upon the invention of the screw press in Byzantine times. Oh. So, it's like 1 plus 1 equals 0. None of this makes sense. This distance between us. It's about a position. And a second position. A way through. And a link. There's nothing left. Nothing else but this distance. And I suppose it seems so obvious. But couldn't we just start again?
So I guess we had a bit of back and forth about this, trying to decide what would be the best way to work with the ideas, and then when we met up to chat about it, there was all these kind of other associations that I brought to this as well, and so we thought maybe we'd kind of, to use maybe the imageries from the film to kind of just tangle the knot up a bit more, I suppose, continue just with a few other visual puns and conceptual puns that might bring out some of the ideas, and also use that as a way to have a conversation. So
I suppose the conversation is always so much within the film, is so much through these objects that it made sense to continue sort of discussing the film through them in a way.
Yeah.
Or this response.
Yeah, so I've got a bag of tricks here, and then I'll use that to elicit some things as well. So I'm going to place some objects here, and then they'll get placed along the floor as well. But if I could have the first slide, please. Well, it's a very bad printout of an image here. I'll put that there, and there's a version of it up here as well. And I guess we'll just use the prop as a starting point, to just think, well, a simple question to start with then. What were the starting points for the video?
Yeah, starting point was, I suppose these things that have maybe existed in previous works, these models, these sculptural kind of maquettes or something that then get made into drawings, and then so a lot of these objects that appear in the film have been around for a while as these kind of studio objects, and so it's this kind of language, I suppose. But then at the beginning, there's this series of kind of metal fabricated objects, these simple forms, I guess, which are almost deliberately acting like as a starting point. Yeah. They're kind of, I was talking about them as like this almost symbolic objects, these very simple kind of, you can put whatever you want on top of them.
Almost symbolic, ideal, almost symbolic.
Yeah.
So a kind of platonic shape.
Yeah, they're platonic, but they're kind of wrong platonic, because they're not platonic solids. They have like this simple one-sided, two-sided, three-sided. So they're dumb platonic solids or something. But they're an excuse for talking about other things, I suppose, or like starting something, and then it just kind of goes, mutates.
Mutates to something else. So I guess you were telling me, and also obviously it's in the video, so people have heard the story as well, with the idea of the Cyprus standing stones and the way that their interpretation changed over the years.
Yeah.
And we started talking about this kind of idea of how the interpretation of something changes the thing itself, but it's also, each of those moments is part of its life. And so this image started developing for us, and I guess one of the associations I had was maybe from Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, where in the novel he's talking about aliens that can see the whole life, or all of time at once, let's say. So a human being looks like a long centipede with a sort of old person at one end and a baby at the other end. And I guess we were thinking about these objects in a similar way. The term that we ended up kind of using was caterpillar, because it's just this sort of extended shape where, let's say if you had the standing stone at one point when they thought it was a thing to crawl through, and another point when it was something that was the olive press, so that all these things kind of become, I guess the point is that the object itself is the squiggle, to use the terminology from the film. So I guess we were trying to think about a way where we could maybe make a caterpillar here as well, conceptually or really, or not. So I guess I wanted to start with the prop shape as something sort of, maybe that sort of almost symbolic shape, but something that could also be an excuse towards something else. If we could have the next slide, please. so this pixelated image, but you can probably see what it is it's a series of concrete cubes just with a sort of glass base on top of it. And this is just something that, it's a system devised by the Italian-Brazilian architect Lino Bobardi, that she devised for the Museum of Art in Sao Paulo. And she just designed these kind of massive, large spaces. And then, but what connected it for me to this was this idea of she wanted to sort of contract art history and people to be able to encounter multiple time periods at once, I guess, and this idea of time being something that could be expanded. And then what I like the idea is these kind of cubes, the props there being another version of this shape that then allows this sort of like time as a dimension that can be traveled. And so this kind of prop becomes a really mundane portal then to allow these sort of travels to happen. I mean, what's interesting as well is that the system itself was abandoned, I think, in the 70s, and actually for a while the only remaining examples of this originally were used in the cafeteria at the museum to just sort of make sure that people were in the line correctly. Yeah. So again, it was this sort of use being twisted a bit.
This kind of idea of misuse of something or misunderstanding.
Yeah, whether deliberate or not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it just becomes, reappropriated for another purpose.
I think they're actually reintroducing that in Sao Paulo again, apparently. This is actually an image from the Van Abbe Museum where they have a room where they use these kind of directly. So there's kind of myths of it that kind of keep propagating as well. So I guess I wanted to think also about the missing sculpture stuff as well. I mean, I know a lot in your work, there are these kind of things that are represented, you know, through drawings or through stories, or like say in the last show we had where it was kind of shapes on the floor.
Yeah, these footprints, I guess it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, where all these kind of sculptural elements, which are the sort of almost the driving thing in my making work, it always seems to be mediated or removed in some way, so that got me thinking about these positions of them and then these kind of stolen statues or cut sculptures, and then being left with this kind of, again, like a very simple form.
Could I get the next slide, please? This is actually an image from Atlanta in Georgia, where as soon as I'd seen the video as well, it was something that I'd been looking at already, so it was kind of an exciting moment. I know it doesn't look that exciting, but this was it was actually a sculpture park in kind of western Atlanta that it opened in 1968. Does anybody know Six Flags? It's kind of an amusement park across the US, but there was a Texas entrepreneur who owned Six Flags, and at the same time, down the road, he'd opened this sculpture park with the idea that families, after they'd had their fun at the roller coasters, could then go and see, and it was, actually filled with sort of more minimalist sculptures. Saul DeWitt, Donald Judd, Joseph Albers had helped design the buildings. And now all that remains is a few concrete plinths, basically. And it's kind of interesting to see. And I guess there's always that question of how do you know something's missing until somebody now tells you it's missing? Or, you see the replacement, or you see the trace of what's left a little bit. And so, again, this kind of plinth as a sort of shape becomes a prop for those kind of hidden histories as well, or maybe a way to access those things, whether those are other times or, might say, other dimensions. But could I just have the next image as well? Just another example of one of the plinths that has since become just a marker for the road. It just has 650 spray painted on it now, painted blue. So I guess we talked a bit about, the shapes being kind of deliberately morphable, so generic, that allows them to kind of take that shape. But I mean, I don't know, I guess I was wondering about the specific choice of some of them. Like, did you have the temptation of picking a coffee mug that had, words on it, or, a donut with icing, or...
I suppose Yeah, they were trying to be like archetypes almost, just like this again, like the coffee cup being. I mean, in an earlier edit, there is this more, comedic. You know, there is a mug with writing on it, but the one that's in this film is just this black kind of outline of the mug, and maybe that's like this sort of idea of these two positions there is in the film, where there's these maybe more of a more of a rational and a sort of slightly more irrational kind of position, I suppose, and the space in between them being this conversation. So yeah, I suppose the objects do relate to that in a certain material in terms of their materiality.
But was it, I mean, maybe kind of sourcing stuff that could do that rather than just taking whatever was around you?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, some of it, but some of it's like that. But then a lot of them are kind of quickly made things out of polystyrene, or so they are deliberately models, I suppose. Yeah.
So I guess, yeah, I mean, one thing we wanted to try and get at, I suppose, in a sense, was the kind of quality of the squiggle, I suppose, if that, say, the stones have been kind of used in different ways, and how those each denote different, maybe not always intimate, but different sort of personal imaginations and relationships with an object, I suppose. And so, I mean, I was kind of interested in thinking about, the different ways shapes can take form, and what kind of transformations they can allow, I suppose, or like when something becomes something else. That you don't always have a control of it, I suppose. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't able to find a square shot glass. So that's just, if we have the power of conceptual conjuring in our minds, then this glass from Lincoln Christmas Market is actually more of a rectangular shape. But yeah, I guess it was partially also to think about maybe where do you think this leads to? I mean, I know that the video has this kind of circular aspect to it.
Well, one thing that is tricky with showing the film like this is that it's kind of devised. It's not devised to be screened as with an audience like this and linearly. It kind of works as more of a sculptural space. So the idea is there's these 4 chapters, I suppose, where there's the flat table, just the tabletop on the floor, the tabletop that grows legs becomes a wall, and then sort of folds around and becomes this more collapsing sculptural space. And each of these chapters exists on a separate screen, sort of at right angles to each other. So there's a space within the middle again that the films are holding, again like an empty space. The audio, the left and right feed. I'm not sure this is answering your question, but it's kind of. I suppose it's about this. It's about a space again in the middle that's empty.
And what's in that space?
Yeah, and this potential for it to carry on shifting.
Could I get the next slide, please? See, I was trying to think about this shape morphing a bit, and I mean, when you think about the use of shapes, I mean, this is a building designed by the postmodern Italian architect Aldo Rossi, who was kind of very into using these kind of Platonic shapes. I mean, there's an interesting, I guess, if it's kind of connection to this and the idea of the multiverse. There was somewhere I read, it was a mediocre science fiction book, but it was positing the idea that the Platonic universe is probably one of the oldest ideas that we're familiar with of the multiverse, that it's kind of a somewhere else that we've imagined. But yeah, Rossi used a lot of very simple shapes in his work, and this is actually for a graveyard in Modena, and the building itself is empty. It hasn't been used, and so it's kind of an interesting, this this shape that's kind of been embodied, but then still remains the kind of empty thing at the same time. We'll let that sit there. That's another image. But maybe just to think about, I don't know if this is kind of an ending point as well. I mean, as is a graveyard image, but I guess maybe to think of sort of the inverse of that shape as well. I was thinking about, this might seem a little bit off topic, but I guess, with these big fancy houses in parts of London where people have been building underneath them, the kind of iceberg houses. And so to think about this sort of rectangular shape as something then inverse being dug into the ground. And maybe what related that to me for this idea of these objects and the kind of what we do or don't know what happens to them as well is the kind of incidental story of that people have been digging these things, and then it's actually become, in some cases, too expensive for the diggers, the machines that were used to dig the hole to be pulled out of the hole again. So they actually just bury them under the building and then leave them there. And so I guess in that sort of anthropological sense or archaeological sense, I like that idea of an object that had been left there that might remain for thousands and thousands of years, and people might wonder what the hell it's doing there at the end of it. And so I just, like the idea of this kind of inverse rectangle that was created with this now defunct object that was kind of sat underneath it. Which I'm not sure exactly how it relates, but then it seemed like a nice kind of...
No, I thought it was, I mean, I guess a lot of the beginning of the film, there's these ideas of like a sort of two-dimensional and a three-dimensional, and then something that kind of inverts and becomes a negative rather than just like a shadow, I suppose. It actually kind of, becomes this negative space. So it's kind of, like a form that kind of grows and ends up sort of inverting. And it seems like a kind of good sort of take on it. Yeah.
Well, maybe in that negative space, we could kind of stop there, I suppose. But if anybody has any questions, I'm sure we can answer them. But
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have a 20 minutes break, and I just want to say thank again to Kit Craig and Chris Fite-Wassilak for the improvisation and the film, Work in Progress show, and for Irene as well for giving us an opportunity to see the second film of Sandra Lahire. So there's a 20 minutes break now, a comfy break, and maybe outdoor break to have some air, and then I see you back here in the gallery space at 10 to 5. after this work. Takeshi Shiomitsu, it's a great privilege that you're here with me in the corner of the space. And I'll hand it over to you.
Okay.
Yeah? Are you okay?
Yes,
Yeah.
sorry. I was just trying to... Hello. These are some notes, mainly polemic and tentatively structured. Okay. Quote, "The sciences certainly have influenced the arts. To an Aztec, the sunset was an inexplicable event which he could not cope with or even survive without the imagined aid of his gods. Obvious phenomena of this sort have since been explained, but the sheer unimagined vastness of the explicable has now made the inexplicable into such a monstrous thing that our heads spin, and the old images burst like bubbles. The thought of the totally inexplicable, as when we look at the starry sky, and the impossibility of reading any sense into this monstrous vastness, so affects us that we need ignorance to survive." End quote. Everything is rendered within boundaries demarcated by infrastructure. While the structure provides context, the infrastructure is the set of processes taking place that inform the way that the structure operates. Trying to find a way out of the disheartening impossibility of contending with structures leads towards analysing infrastructures, trying to make it possible to dismantle infrastructure, how we might be able to imagine different social and political organisational architecture. I want to make a distinction here as well in relation to earlier comments in the day about images. I want to argue that the image is distinct from the document. The document can be seen as representation, literally documentation, which tells us only that a thing is in being, a thing exists. I have more hope for the image as an artifact that tries to communicate more than just what is represented. The image draws on our existing knowledge of the world and opens up questions, forcing us to reflect on both ourselves and the world in which we are living. An image is made within the mind of the viewer. What looks like an image is not itself an image, it is created by the faculties of the mind. This is also to say that an image can be composed of any type of artifact. It doesn't limit itself to the pictorial. It can be words or gestures, image here defined loosely as a general impression. And also to say that we should not conflate. To talk about a human is not the same as talking about a universal subject. Experience differs radically. Access to particular forms of being, communications, and other experiences are restricted by the ability of a given subject to find within themselves the ability to access these things. This is something to question. The idea that our immediate surroundings, the people and experiences we surround ourselves with based on our own homophilic tendencies, constitute the limits of human experience. There is an alienation that I'm sure everyone has felt when presented with an image we are unable to cognize, that we are unable to gain access to in any way. It's down to a gap in experience and a gap in knowledge. Images are infrastructural components that contribute towards our perception of the world. Unless you have never witnessed an image, perception of the world cannot exist outside of the formation of an understanding of the world drawing on the image as a reference point. This also occurs in the inverse. We are able to comprehend an image as long as we are able to draw references to the real world. To examine an infrastructure, we must first consider a structure, examine it from the core to the margins. Images can be signs and force us to cognize a particular thought in the way that an essay or piece of academic writing attempt to. Images can be used as direct allegory. These images that are signs are documents, perhaps. Images can be recontextualized in order to undermine their structural qualities and produce new meaning every time we attempt to dissolve, rematerialize, undermine, or recontextualize images. The mountain can be found very easily. The mountain is a geological formation that exists because of seismic shifting land. These events have occurred and will continue to occur. Nothing is taller than the mountain. Anything taller than the mountain is hubris. In some cases, the mountain has roads cut into it and people in vehicles drive up it. In some cases, cable cars allow ease of access to the top. In Western or Christian mythology, Moses went to the top of Mount Sinai to collect the Ten Commandments. The implication of this act is probably that the mountain is closer to God. Expensive-looking shots are produced for film and television of protagonists on mountaintops, protagonists scaling mountains. The implication of this is perhaps that to scale a mountain is to conquer nature. Or perhaps it's the personal journey of the protagonist depicted, or a shared journey of the group of protagonists depicted, all in it for different but equally heartening reasons. Perhaps the mountain is a metaphor and they are trying to conquer themselves, something like that. The mountaintop is so far from civilization that no one observes them achieving this achievement. It's just for themselves. Or maybe, as they climb, they are imagining images of themselves scaling the mountain, remembering images they've seen on film or TV, thinking, what a fantastic image this could be if shot by an experienced director of photography with high enough production budget. Or recalling images they have seen before of people scaling mountains, whatever. This does not happen with such frequency with diving, which is an inversion of this model, into the darkness and unknown rather than towards the light and the scalable. Sinking down rather than climbing up, it's not so much about conquering as about convergence. The sea is not land. Conquering narratives are rarely, if ever, mapped onto sea exploration. The history of colonialism rarely took place underwater. Sometimes images of mountains are found in political or corporate identification. Mountains, landscapes, nature, and the subsequent feeling that they induce are deployed by some group or other. We see an image and understand, okay, nature is a material thing that is greater than us. In historical and some contemporary nationalist propaganda, these images of nature are used to indicate that the specific land, demarcated by borders set by some historical event, is a unique and powerful land. Quote, and did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green? End quote. Through deploying images of nature, those previously purely conceptual borders become the hard edges of a material reality. Maybe a drawing of a mountain from a photograph is an attempt to grasp the futility and intricacy of the concept of a landmass observed in isolation as an object. Not all mountains are the same, of course, and it doesn't have to be mountains, really. Canyons are just as good, perhaps even better, if they are particularly iconic. Maybe quarries, or even fields or plains at a push, as long as it's not the sea. There are a number of different types of white pigment, each of which have a number of different applications. Example 1. Zinc oxide is used to treat or prevent minor skin irritations such as burns, cuts, poison ivy, poison oak, poison sumac, and diaper rash. It is applied to the abrasions to accelerate healing. It is also used as sunscreen. Scientific findings have confirmed the long UVA rays, 340 to 400 nanometers, are primarily responsible for premature aging of the skin. Zinc white protects very well in this range. Example 2. Gofun shirayuki, or Japanese pearl white, is made from oyster shells. The oyster shells are collected in large heaps by the seaside in Kyoto, where they start rotting quickly in the warm and humid climate. During a span of 5 to 10 years, the organic compounds decompose, leaving behind finest pearl white flakes. They are ground further and sorted by size to produce the most important white in the history of Japanese art and crafts. Gofun is used like a white gilding ground. It is mixed with a rabbit skin solution and applied on a sized ground, then burnished to a gloss with an agate burnisher. Territories can be conceptualized by what is contained within them. Those making a claim for ideological control over a territory must first claim the material content in order to position their ideology as positioned within a unique context. Without this, borders would make very little sense. So the majesty of a particular geological instance can be used as an indicator by those interested in the deployment of this sign of the ideological implication of the territory, usually that it is powerful, important, majestic, insurmountable, etc. Those who use images of nature attempt to make a case that territories are demarcated not by the subjects populating the territory, but by undeniable material reality. The subsequent arguments they make for racial purity or economic prosperity or whatever are interchangeable. Only one fact remains. Nature exists, it is in being. Maybe we think we are immune to images, that we can maintain a critical distance in being able to objectively decipher their meaning. But this is just our subjective position shifting from reading an image to seeing a document. As in, yes, okay, I get it. This geological instance, which exists only within the boundaries of the state in which I live, is being deployed as a sign to stress the significance of the state in which I live. State can mean political or ontological. Wow. Okay, I understand. The fact that I exist in this territory is determined by the deployment of this image in this context to be morally good. But an acceptance of the understanding of images in this way is complicity with their function as purely semiotic. Visual representations, images, pictures, all relegated to the purely semiotic is unsatisfactory. The edges of a mountaintop may be blurred by cloud formations. Bad weather can sometimes cause communication fuzz. From the ground we might see a cumulus obscuring a portion of mountain or hill, but say that we are on a mountain or hill where the air is thinner, or a scientist might say there's less oxygen content in our immediate surroundings, but anyway, the air is thinner. We might experience this as a fog. It's obvious, yeah? The cloud, as an object concept, exists only in the context of the sky. The cloud is a white, sometimes grey object with soft edges that obscures. Images touch you, but they can never be touched. The physical material, pigment, etc. can be touched. An image is not an illustration. An image exists on observation, constituted in a gap in knowledge. New images must be made because the existing ones are unsatisfactory and inadequate. Making new images is making new ways to look or see. Maybe technologies have geared us towards thinking that technological progress is analogous to social progress, and the aesthetics of newness are analogous with social progress. The future is exactly what we thought it might be, somehow inadequate. In 1945, the year before director Frank Capra released the holiday classic It's a Wonderful Life, he released a film commissioned by the US government called Know Your Enemy, Japan. It was a sort of strange, racist film. Captain Robert Lewis was the co-pilot of the Enola Gay, the American plane which dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In 1970, he finished work on a white marble sculpture of a mushroom cloud. Quote, "Art is making sense and giving shape to that sense. It is like the religious search for God. We are well aware that making sense and picturing are artificial like illusion, but we can never give them up." End quote. Thanks.
Wow, yeah, so this is the end of the NEMATODE event. First of all, I would just like to say thank to Takeshi for a really poetic and thoughtful presentation on perception and imagery. And I was really astonished how the film that Irene Revell has chosen of Sandra Lahire somehow connected with a really mesmerizing, also very disturbing imagery. And I would love to say thanks as well to all of the artists who've contributed, obviously to the whole residency, so Kit Craig, Takeshi Shiomitsu, and Joey Holder. and to all of the external contributors today, Emily Rosamond and Fite-Wassilak and Irene Revell. So I'm not going to kind of conclude in how all of this is kind of necessarily connected, but maybe we can think about kids' wiggly worm and create our own thoughts on Umwelt and discuss all of this further over drink in the reception or perhaps even outside because it's such a lovely day. So thanks a lot for all of you coming here, and thanks a lot for our online audience as well. We've put out evaluation forms, so it would be nice to hear your feedback from what you thought of the event. It's always valuable. So thank as well, and hopefully we can just continue all of these discussions over a drink now. Thank you.